That is exactly what the Israelis like to have, these kind of arrangements, because this protects them from criticism and say, hey, you're an apartheid state. And say, oh, no, 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 we have this temporary problem and we're working on it. We have this peace plan. And of course, the peace plan never goes forward. There's the Oslo process, in the West Bank. Actually, nothing ever is implemented for the Palestinians, and the Israelis just continue with their ethnic cleansing. But when people point at it and say, "Oh, we got this peace process, but there's real obstacles," and you just have to be patient. Now, that really worked for a long time. I think it doesn't really work, again, with the great majority of people. People have become rightly skeptical of Israel and understand that they're lying. It really did work effectively in the past. People just it was a smokescreen that allowed them to carry out a slow motion ethnic cleansing. I don't think the smokescreen is nearly as effective, but like you say, it's just people have taken their eyes off of Gaza. There's this assumption that peace has come. That's how it's reported in the Israeli papers too. It's just like the war is over, but the suffering isn't over. The ethnic cleansing isn't over for the Gazans or for the people in the West Bank. Again, these last 2 years have been really terrible in the West Bank, not nearly as bad as in Gaza, and that's why we haven't paid attention to it. But the ethnic cleansing really was ratcheted up there, and it's continued now. It's just like. And we're seeing it happen again in southern Lebanon. There's a wall that's being built, not on the international boundary. That's an old Israeli trick.
Well, it sounds like Israel's getting away with it, or will get away with it. And I don't like to think that that's true or possible. Do you think that they will be able to just commit a genocide live stream to much of the world, or half a genocide, whatever you want to call it?
Well, they have gotten away with it to a great. Again, I think if you want to point a finger at anybody, well, first of all, the U.S., because the U.S. enables all of this, is an active, you can say, a real participant, not just passively complicit, but actively complicit. So first of all, point your finger at the U.S., but then point your finger at the neighboring Arab and Muslim states, at Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, okay? Because these are Muslim states. These are their fellow Sunnis, and they have betrayed them. It's a huge betrayal. And if they had stood up, if at some point Erdogan had cut off the oil, that could have made a real difference, but he never did.
Why?
And he even had
blackmail too? Do you think they're afraid? I just feel like the whole
I don't think there's
world
blackmail, but
there's always some looming threat of blackmail. We talked about just the nuclear blackmail threat.
Okay, well, that's in the. I think that probably applies more to Iran. They have to keep that into.
I know, but it just permeates throughout everybody's consciousness. Israel might kill me.
I think it comes down to it. These are corrupt leaders who are. That they know that they need to condemn the Israelis, but they limit it just to these verbal condemnations. They stand by Palestine, but only rhetorically. Many of them, are personally enriched by the relationship with both the U.S. and Israel. And that's how they look at it. That's for them. Unfortunately, I think that's that's what they really care about. And the lives of these people in Gaza are secondary, or less than secondary. They just don't care, and that's a real sad truth.
Well, Israel can't get away with it completely. We've said before that just the damage that has been done to Israel has been irreparable, right? So there is a price to pay, and they are paying it, and Israel is on, is on borrowed time. Would you say? Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, again, it's just like this polls show that among younger people, like people under 50, that there's now more sympathy for Palestinians in the U.S. than for Israel. And that's, again, a huge shift. And then, like, the younger you get, the more that pronounced that is. So even like young Republicans under 30, it's like there's more sympathy for Palestine. That's, again, enormous. You wouldn't have seen that even a couple years ago. So there's been a seismic change, or a tectonic shift in opinion in the U.S. And I'm sure you'll find similar things in similar survey results in Europe. And that's bound to hurt them. I think there's no question about it. That is, again, they can ignore it, or they can find fixes to the problem in the short run, but in the long run, that's going to haunt them. And the Israelis, obviously they are worried about that. You're getting these very radical responses from Zionist elites in this country, and we've talked about that. So that's, they have been hurt by that. No question they've been hurt severely in the court of world public opinion. They are a pariah state, and that's nothing that's happening right now is going to change that. Now, and unfortunately, you see, like within like Western Europe and the U.S., the fact that the so-called ceasefire is in place has allowed governments to even reverse the very minor sanctions that they had imposed on Israel. For example, I think in Germany there was a suspension of arms shipments. Well, now they've been renewed, or there was some suspension of some cooperative military agreements. Now those have been renewed, but. Those are the Western elites. And we always knew that they weren't sincere about their protests or their condemnation of Israel. They're showing that now by their actions. But in the court of world opinion, Israel has already lost. And you can say, well, I guess, people like Netanyahu, they say, so what? We have the U.S. at our back. But they've lost the younger generation, the U.S. already. And that younger generation is going to come to power at some point.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I've said before that so many people, I think, are going to become one-issue voters when it comes to, like, are you taking money from AIPAC? Are you going over and kissing the wall? Are you saying I stand with Israel over and over again? And then that'll just be like, we're done. But then I'm also just thinking that people change so quickly. They forget about things and just move on. So it does worry me that we can just let this slide. Like, think about like how crazy things were during COVID. And now it's just like, people don't talk about it. And like, that was a crazy time, right? Are we going to reflect and think about what we did wrong and maybe try to fix things? Or just like 9/11 or Iraq. A lot of people just, just won't ask questions, just move on. And then, just all these things. So it does.
No, you're right. It's true. Yeah, but it's still the damage has been done. I think there's been a fundamental. Maybe you don't have the focus on Israel, but the focus will come back because other things will happen. Again, the crazies are still in charge in Israel, and they actually are not going to be. They've taken a lot. They took more than half of Gaza right here, and they took a big chunk of Syria. They took a piece of Lebanon, and they want to take more. I think there's no question about it. But they're going to, again, those people that are in charge, who really are, Netanyahu and his coalition, those people are going to. Every indication tells us that they're drifting even farther into extremism, into this reckless, almost apocalyptic frame of mind, and they're going to be further actions. They have been emboldened by so much of what's happened, and they're going to continue to overreach themselves. And I just hope that's the sad thing again, is that you don't have any resistance from neighboring powers, but maybe at some point there will be a real revolution in these countries, in a place like Turkey or Egypt, which would make a difference. Maybe we will see a real change in policy in the U.S., but I don't foresee it within the near future. In the short run, it looks like Israel is sitting pretty, and I hate to say that, but that's what it looks like. In the long run, again, I'll just say it's looking very grim for them.
But when you're saying like it's sitting pretty, then that means that they'll start to overreach again. I mean, they're already starting in Lebanon, right? They're doing more and more actions in Lebanon and expanding, and so. I mean, there is this sort of note of or an air of inevitability about war with Iran, but that also has faded away, and I think a
Yeah.
lot of people are like, maybe it's just not going to happen, and then I mean, I know we shouldn't want that to happen, but it felt like Iran was the only power in the region that could actually defeat Israel, just straight on.
Right.
Otherwise, we're going to see Israel continue to slaughter people in the West Bank and in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Syria, just sort of move slowly. This is and embolden them further until eventually something big happens. It sounds like. Is that
Yeah.
what you see?
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, that's right. And I think it is true that Iran is the only real rival, the only country that could beat them in a war, and that's why they've been fixated on Iran for such a long time, because they understand that. It's just so they want to take out Iran, and they tried, they back in June, but they failed, and I'm sure they're looking for an opportunity to try again. I again don't think it's going to happen soon. I think they need to, again, the IDF is really worn down. Their stockpiles need to be replenished and all that. And they need to come up with a new plan. They had this very ingenious, what was it, Operation Rising Lion plan that they used, to achieve some kind of regime change. It failed, but it was ingenious, you have to say, and it did inflict some serious damage on the Iranians, but that's something you can't just do again. Of course, the Iranians have, in response, have been rolling up all kinds of intelligence networks, and they realized that they had been penetrated deeply by the Israelis, and I don't know if the Israelis will ever be able to penetrate Iran in the same fashion again. So what are they going to do? Well, they've shown themselves, let's admit it, just to be very creative. And I'm sure they're cooking up some sort of diabolical scheme now.
Do you think most people in Israel support something like that?
Well, unfortunately, they do. That's one thing, I'm struck because, again, I follow the news in Haaretz, which is the, flagship left-wing newspaper within Israel. And sometimes you get some genuinely good and compassionate articles about the Palestinians there. But it seems like when it comes to Iran or Hezbollah or anything else, they're actually just completely in agreement with their government. Even this Netanyahu-led government and the IDF and everything that they do against Iran or Hezbollah seems to be justified. I didn't see any sort of reflection on the morality of their decapitation strikes in both places. There does seem to be general support. There is general support for those kind of attacks and wars.
Hey, doesn't that surprise you? Don't you find that a little bit odd? I mean, for several reasons. I mean, the Israelis saw what Iran was able to do to Israel.
Yeah.
Hypersonic missiles landing in Tel Aviv. You can't hide that. That was intense. Those few days were crazy. And so aren't they aware that, like, hey, this is this is not good for us. This could mean our destruction.
Yeah.
And then the other thing also is just, they're a small country, and they travel. They have ties to Europe and the U.S., and they travel. Every time they travel, they have to hide the fact that they're Israeli. Because they're hated globally. Don't you think at some point there's some kind of self-reflection, like maybe there's something wrong that we're doing in my country, and I should speak out against it, because
Right.
That's not a good feeling. How does a whole country just be okay with this type of being a pariah?
Yeah. Well, they're not okay. They are aware of that problem. Again, I've seen several articles in Haaretz about that, about the the general, let's say, discomforts, worries of Israeli tourists abroad, and the very uncomfortable situations they find themselves. They get kicked out of restaurants and so on and so forth. And, fairness to the leftists and Haaretz, they do understand that the way they look at this is because of the policies of Netanyahu. And, this is, we need to stop. He's gone too far. He has provoked this hostility towards us. So there is that awareness. And I think there's up to a point. But even on the left, you find the kind of the reflexive self-justification, which is, it's just anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head. It just, a, a reluctance even on the left, and I think it's, when you get to the right, it's just not even there. A reluctance to really to self-reflect, to ask, maybe it's something that we're doing. There's this knee-jerk reaction. It's anti-Semitism. Anybody who criticizes us, anybody who's hostile to us, it's just because they have this irrational disease, which is called anti-Semitism. And it can't be anything that we're doing. Unfortunately, that's what you find, I think, in the majority of Israelis. But there is a significant minority that is aware of that and is bothered by that. Because I think a lot of the leftist Israelis are also, cosmopolitan, travel often. And they see what's happening. They see that there have been real consequences to the actions of their government, and they are disturbed by it.
Well, do you think that will manifest into any actual change within Israel? Like because that's always something that you kind of hope that maybe Israelis have this, as Biden said, a come to Jesus moment.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, no. And it's something that even the leftists themselves discuss among themselves, to just say that they are a minority and they are a cowed minority, meaning that they're actually kind of afraid to stick their necks out. And a lot of times there are threats of violence when they do. There are brave individuals that have spoken out against the genocide, and they get death threats. And the thing is, you have to be, death threats get thrown around, and the great majority of them, like in this country, can be safely ignored. I understand that not to justify the death threats, but that's usually it's just talk. In Israel, you really have to ask the question. These people are violent, and they have power, and so when you get a death threat, well, it's scary. You just don't know if a mob is going to show up your house or somebody's going to assassinate you. It could happen. So in general, that, let's say, dissident community, which is already very small, is even less effective than its numbers would indicate. It's just they're afraid to speak out.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's two things kind of going on. There's Israel's continued aggression into Gaza, Lebanon, the West Bank, and eventually that might spark, and Syria, and eventually this might spark something larger. But then there's the other thing that is going on here in this country, even though that Gaza might be starting to sort of fade from some people's minds and memories. The U.S. influence, Israeli influence in U.S. politics is not gone away. That still is a battle that's being fought front and center.
Very much
and so I think in that sense, Israel can't get away with it. They might be able to get away with Gaza. And unfortunately, for so many people, like here domestically, it's like, okay, it's not being shown on our TVs and phones so much anymore. We just forget about it. But seeing what's happening here in this country and how the Israel firsters and the Zionists are just at war with a lot of the American firsters, I think that can't disappear. And so many people, I think, used to just have when they thought of Israel back in the day, it was just like, oh, that's just our friendly country, one of our good allies, and they're similar to us. That's about as far as they went. Now this association with Israel has been tainted, and I don't think that can fade away. So even though Gaza might forget, people will just have sort of this visceral reaction when they hear like, oh, he supports Israel. I don't like that. And so I think that's
I think that's right. It's like, I think the last episode you were talking about how your generation and the next, well, it's really, I guess it's Generation Z. I can't keep track of these generations, but it's the younger, like the under 30s. Their, the formative experiences and connection to Israel are so very, very different from, let's say, the experiences of my generation. And I had to go on this long journey to understand what was happening in Israel. And it actually took some real effort. I had to go to some unusual bookstores and that kind of thing. That's the way it was in the past. But they have, they have grown up. They never had that respect for Israel. It wasn't, and what they remember, like maybe their real first memories of Israel, are, the horrible, the horrible genocide within Gaza. and that's not going to go away. That's, I think, been burned into them, and that's where that's their starting point, and it's going to be that, for into the foreseeable future, and that again does not bode well for the future of, let's say, American support for Israel.
Right. And I think couple that with just the economic malaise in this country, as things become more and more unaffordable, especially for younger people, like the first time they're able to buy a house now is close to 40 years old. People just can't afford to live in this country and live the American dream that our, parents and grandparents had. It's not the same thing anymore. And when that happens, people are going to look for people to blame. And it's always scapegoating, not saying that all of the blame is valid, but a lot of people will be angry at countries like Israel that have been hijacking what they thought was the United States government to focus on Israel's priorities rather than America's priorities. When people here in this country are saying like things are really, really bad, we need to focus things like, hold on, shut up, we got to give more money to Israel, help them out some more, and we'll give you guys a 50-year mortgage so you can be in debt for the rest of your life. This isn't going to fly. So I think in that sense, it's a very negative outlook, but that's what needs to happen to break this relationship with Israel. But it's also just been, you saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's resigning, she was one of the few people in Congress. Now there's just Thomas Massey left basically.
Yeah. Well, you do have people on the Democrat side that are very, but I think it's particularly valuable to have those people on the right. There has been again, like you find among young Democrats, the support for Israel has just essentially evaporated. It's just not. It's probably in the single digits or something. I think that's right. On the Republican side, it's actually evaporating pretty rapidly, but there's still a residual support for Israel, and so I think it was particularly important to have those. It is important to have those voices there, and I am sorry to hear that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to step down in January.
Yeah. There's talk about her going for president in 2028. She's denied it, but Polymarket is showing her at 7-8% already. People are saying. One last thing that I don't know if you noticed that that X released a feature recently that shows the location of users, and the Department of Homeland Security. It showed that the account was opened in Israel and is operated out of Tel Aviv. That's what it showed there. There's a lot of screenshots and videos of it. And as soon as that happened, they disabled that feature, and then they re-released it, and then it changed for the Department of Homeland Security. And people saying, Grok was saying, it was a glitch. What kind of glitch? That's not how code works. It doesn't just randomly select land on a country. There's a reason it displayed Israel. Even if you're using a VPN first of all, why would you be VPNing from DC into Israel? It doesn't make sense. Very fishy. But there's just more damnations. It's like, holy, that's unbelievable though. The Department of Homeland Security was created in Israel and for the United States, and it was operated out of Tel Aviv. If that's true, which I have every reason, I don't see anything that can convince me that it's not true. I can just say it. I'm not going to believe this is just
I think
a glitch.
It probably reflects the huge, unwarranted role that Israeli IT companies play in the U.S. government. They're just. This comes up again and again. For example, there's software that the U.S. government uses provided by Israel, and then it's discovered that there's a back door, and the Israelis have been using it to, snoop on us, and that's just sort of a constant news item. That comes up again and again. So I suspect this is something similar. It's just like some sort of IT company who's like, well, we'll set up the website for you. Don't worry.
This is just creating the X account. Through the Israeli App Store. It was
right.
They were
you would
just,
think that they would
just there. So it's just like,
that's true. Yeah, good point.
It's wild. If that's true that we've been using Israeli tech all the time, we always know that it has a back door, then it begs the question, why do we keep on using Israeli tech? It's because they have people on our side as well, in our government, that are pushing it and saying, we use this, use that. And it's like, so the problem, we really truly are an occupied country. You know, like I don't know if that's too much of a hyperbole.
Yeah,
It's
maybe,
insane.
when it comes to Middle East policy, I don't think it is. It
The Department of
doesn't apply
Homeland
to,
Security.
yeah,
Is,
right.
I mean, they didn't even create that account in America. I mean,
Yeah,
come
that's pretty
on. It's
weird. Yeah, I don't,
Homeland Security.
yeah, but it doesn't mean they actually control it. Let's
Yeah, but
be careful
I
about
mean,
what we say.
I know,
But
but
yeah,
I mean,
no,
it
there's
shows that
obviously
there's.
undue influence. And when it comes to, again, I think Middle Eastern policy, to say control is, maybe a little too strong, but it's basically true.